Alright guys, welcome back. In this session, we'll be going through everything that you need to know about worksheet and workbook events. Okay, so what are worksheet and workbook events? Okay, up until this point, we have been writing procedures in a module and then we triggered them by going to the Visual Basic application and running them manually, right? We go to the Visual Basic application, look for the macro, and then we'll run them. Okay, now we are going to trigger the macro by using events. Okay, events can exist in workbook, worksheets, ActiveX control, and user form events. Okay, we're not going to worry about ActiveX control and user forms yet. That's something that we're going to cover in the future. So for now, shift your focus solely on workbook and worksheet events. Okay, so workbook events, the events that occur in a workbook, right? For example, opening the workbook, closing the workbook, and before saving the workbook. Worksheet events are events that are associated to worksheet. For example, changing a cell value, selecting a cell, double-clicking a cell, and etc. Okay, so workbook and worksheet events, okay, they're not written in a module. They're not written in a module, but rather it's written in the very sheet we are interested to trigger the macro. So what I mean by that is that if I go to my Visual Basic application, we're not inserting a module. We're actually going, is this a fresh sheet workbook, right, with a single sheet? So if I want to trigger a macro that is specifically targeting sheet 1, then I'm going to go to sheet 1, and then on a general, I'm going to go to worksheet, and then I'm going to be able to see the list of available worksheet events. Okay, so I could select them and then write my code underneath it. Okay, so that is for worksheet events, how to access worksheet events. For workbook events, you're going to go to this workbook. Likewise, if you're on general, change it to workbook, and you'll be able to see the list of available workbook events. So there's a lot of worksheet and workbook events. However, the good news is you won't be using most of them. All right. In the VBA world, we are only using a selected few worksheet and workbook events, which I will be explaining to you in a while. Okay. So for now, just know how to access the worksheet and workbook events. Right. The Visual Basic application for worksheet on the sheet, for workbook on this workbook. Okay. So what are the most common worksheet events, right? So the two most common worksheet events are the selection change and change events, right? So you have to remember, selection can be multiple cells, right? If I go 1, I can select, right? These are all multiple selections. Selections, and you can have multiple selections at any given time, but you can only have one cell activated at a given time. Okay? You have to remember that. Okay? So the selection change is when you're changing from one cell to another. The change event is basically when you are changing values in a cell, right? Even if you're deleting a value, it's considered part of the change event, okay? Right? So in a worksheet event, our first interest is the cell address we would like to designate to trigger the event, okay? So the general approach in a worksheet event is we have all this cell address, and we want to first identify the cell that we are interested to execute a particular command. Okay, suppose if I'm interested in this range and maybe this range, then I have to designate these two range, right, in the worksheet event. Okay, and the next question is, once you have designated the cell address, what are the type of events that you like to associate with it? For example, if I'm going to use this range and this range, what are the events associated to these two ranges? Is it a selection change? Is it a change, or the list of whatever events that you may have on the worksheet, right? So if we go down, anything, it could be any of those, right? Okay, so that's basically what it means, right? So one key important thing to remember is the risk of falling into an endless loop. Okay, we'll go into that later on, okay, but just remember that you need to use the application.enable events false, right? That basically helps us to prevent us from running into an endless loop. We will discuss the endless loop in the upcoming lecture, okay, so not to worry about that. Okay, so now let's get on to the worksheet event, whereby we would like to designate the cell, right? So there are two ways. First, we're going to use the target.address and not intersect method. Okay, target.address and not intersect method. Okay, suppose if I want a selection change event triggered at range C5 to D6, range F5 and G5. Okay, there are two ways for me to do it. One, I could use the target.address. Okay, I could say target.address equals to C5, or target.address equals to C6, target.address equals to D5, target.address equals to D6, or F5 or G5. Okay, I cannot do something like target.address equals to C5 to D10. Okay, it does not allow me to do this in Excel VBA. Okay, this is not allowed. So this can be a little bit inconvenient, especially if you're dealing with a large range of cell. All right. So this is the reason why we would use the not intersect method. The not intersect method is nothing. Okay, the not intersect target range is nothing. It's a fancy way of saying, hey, if this selection event, if this range that I have designated occurs, if the event is within this range, then trigger the macro, right? So this method requires you to understand how to concatenate range together, especially in complex range cases, which I've discussed in the earlier slides. Remember when we went through the details on how to parse syntax for continuous and non-continuous range? Well, this is one instance where that knowledge will come in handy. All right. Okay. So we'll be practicing this problem in this session. Okay. Before we move on to the application enable events, the endless loop, we'll discuss that. Right. So another couple things that I'd like to touch. Right. Generally, when I use worksheet or workbook events, okay, I do not write the commands, right, the operations of what the code does in the event. Rather, what I would do is actually I use the worksheet events to designate the event type, and the event cells that I'm interested in. And then once I've identified these two, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to call the macro that I've written in the procedure. Okay, that's the right way to go about when you're working with worksheet and workbook events. You do not want to write your codes, all right, your statement codes in the worksheet or the workbook events. Okay, we try to avoid that. These worksheet and workbook events, they're intended for us to designate the type of events we are interested, the cell address that we're interested in, and then we just call the macro if those cell address have been selected, right? Okay, that's basically how we go about, right? So another thing that we often use, the target.count large, or you could use target.count or target.count large greater than 1. Okay, then we exit sub. All right, this is basically useful in change events. All right, especially when you are trying to. Okay, remember when I told you that change events can be triggered when you're deleting cells, right? Okay, so suppose I'm deleting a range of cells. Okay, and I do not want my macro to be triggered by the deletion of the cell. So this is when I might want to use target.count large greater than 1, right? Because it's associated to an unwanted operation. It's associated to an unwanted operation. So if I'm deleting a range of cells, and one of the cell happens to be in the designated cell of interest, then the macro is going to be triggered. So that's what I'm going to say. If target.count large is greater than 1, okay, basically if it's greater than 1, so what I'm saying is that, well, if I'm doing something in bulk, right, whether if I'm deleting all the cells, if I'm highlighting the cells, right, even highlighting the cells could trigger the change events, I believe, then I don't want that to be a cause to trigger the macro, okay? Right? So endless loop, right? We're not worried about that too much. Okay. So the most common workbook events are, as I've said, we don't have to know all of them. Is a few that we need to know is the open, activate, and deactivate. Remember the difference between selected, and activate. Okay, you can have multiple selections in a worksheet, okay, or workbook. Okay, you can have multiple cells. You can have multiple sheets selected, but you can only have one sheet, one workbook, and one cell activated at any given time. All right. So that's about it for the theoretical part of the worksheet and workbook events. All right. So before I move on to the VBA editor, you might ask me, why do we want to use workbook and worksheet events? All right. There's several reasons. Okay. Number one is that it enhances the user interface enhancement, right? Enhances the user interface enhancements. Basically, you want to develop an application that interacts with the users when the user is performing certain operation, right? So it's doing something that is not supposed to do, right? You can perform some kind of validation, right? You can return some kind of validation, right? So it's a form of automation that actually helps to enhance the overall experience of the users, all right? So that's the reason why we want to use worksheet and workbook events. Okay, so that's about it. Let's get on to example here, right? Suppose we want a selection change event triggered at range C5 to D6, F5, and G5. okay? And we want to return the message box hello when this has been, when we are in any of these a cell address of C5 to D6, F5 and G5, right? And the event we're interested in is a selection change, right? Remember, the selection change is when you're changing from one cell to another. The change is when you're changing value in a cell, right? So you got to remember that, okay? So in this case, we're interested in the selection change event and the range, and we're going to return a message box hello, right? So a good practice is basically I'm going to insert a module, and then I'm just going to insert my sub call. Okay, I'm just going to call this, and then maybe I can't name it with call, right? So I'm just going to just have call one, right? Maybe, right? Just going to do that. And then I'm just going to say message box hello, right? I told you a good practice is to always write your statement codes in a macro and then to call it upon, right, into the worksheet. Okay, so what worksheet are we interested in? We're interested, what worksheet event I'm interested in is a selection change, right? Basically, we are changing from one cell to another. Okay, so I'm going to look for the selection change. I have the selection change event, right? So it's given me this, right? I'm going to write my code right between these two lines, okay, right? So the first method is I'm going to use a target dot address. Okay, we're going to use the target dot address. And remember when I told you about target dot address, the fact that you can't do, I'm just going to have 0, 0, okay, because I don't want to have the pound sign in front of it. If you don't have 0, 0, then you have to indicate it with a pound sign, F, whatever it is, F, and then 5. I don't want to do that. So that's why I just leave it as 0, 0, right? So I can express that in a relative form. So C5, I can't do something like this, right? C5 to D10. No, can't do that. Target dot address, one cell at a time, right? So I'm going to write it. I'm just going to write it here. Target dot address, one cell at a time. Okay, so target dot address equals to C5 or target dot address 0, 0 equals to C6, right? Or okay, I can just copy this too, right? I'm just going to copy this because we want to save time, right? They're exactly the same. We're just going to change the cell address, right? So that I'm going to change to C5, C6. Then we have D5, D6, right? D5, D6, and then we have F5 and G5, right? We have F5 and G5, right? That's this address, F5 and G5. Yep, right? Okay, so I can just paste it. I think I've copied it earlier, right? So F5 and G5. Then I'm going to say, I'm not going to write or. Okay, I can have if multiple if. It should just be, right? Correct. Okay, so it's a single if statement. Then what I'm going to say is call. What was the procedure name? Call one, right? Just call one, right? Then call one. Call one, right? Right. So that's about it. Now I have to use the word call and the name of our macro that we're calling, right? So now if I get on to C5, I have an end if. What's wrong with me? Okay. I'm going to reset the macro. Then we're going to get to C5, right? C6, right? So we're on C5, right? D5, D6, and then we're on F5. So F6, nothing happens, right? F5, yes. G5, right? So this is a selection change event, okay? So this is the one way to do it, but as I've said, it's a very inconvenient way to do it. So what you want to use is the not intersect method. Not intersect is nothing, right? So the target, and then what's the range? The range, well, we know how to reference continuous range and non-continuous range, right? Remember the comma separation was very important. We have gone through in detail all of that. So if you're combining it with the last row, whatever it is, then you want to write it separately, right? And then express them as a string, and then you just paste it there, right? I've gone through the detail of it, right, in the early lecture on how to reference continuous and non-continuous range. Okay, so if you're not sure about that, please go back to the lecture, double bracket. Okay, so I'm going to say is nothing. So it's a fancy way of saying if my target is within this range. Okay, not intersect target. Okay, then I'm going to call the whatever it is, and then I'm just going to end the if. All right, so this is a much shorter code, and it's going to give us the same result, believe it or not, right? So on C5 now, right, it's giving me the same results. Okay, E5, E6. So if I'm on any other cell, it's not going to give me. Now I'm F5, it's giving me results. Okay, it's giving me the results of the message box. Okay, so that's what I meant. All right, so the key takeaway for this lecture is number one, what the first thing my approach is, what's the event that you're interested in. Second thing, what cells am I interested to call upon the procedure. The third thing is not to write your statement codes in the worksheet or workbook events. Write it inside a module, and then you just call it, right? No matter how short the code is, right? I could actually say message box hello, but I don't want to do that because I don't want to set a wrong impression to you guys, right? So do it the way that I'm doing it right here. Okay, so I'll see you in the next lecture where we'll go into application.enable events for the endless loop case, and then we will also go and do some practice problems. All right, guys, I'll see you then.